So I want to say welcome everyone to tonight's talk called Massachusetts Hikes Through History. I'm very glad to see you all here with us, but before I start, I'm going to make sure you're muted in the beginning before Alison starts her talk. However, if you have a question you'd like to ask as we go along, just put it in the chat box and I will pose it to her at the end of the hour. You also will have the ability to unmute yourself and ask something after she's done with her presentation. Let's see here. Milton Access Cable is filming this event for viewing later, and I want to thank the Friends of the Milton Public Library for their support of my programs. Now, let me tell you about tonight's presenter. Author Alison O'Leary is an award-winning journalist and co-author with Michael Tugias of the Appalachian Mountain Club's guide called Best Day Hikes Near Boston, and also the guide called Inns and Adventures, A History and Explorer's Guide to New Hampshire, Vermont, and the Berkshires. In addition, she has co-authored these nonfiction titles: Attacked at Sea, Abandoned Ship, the True World War II Story about the Sinking of the Laconia, and So Close to Home, the True Story of an American Family's Fight for Survival in World War II. Again, co-authored by Michael Tugias. In 2017, she won the Silver Charlie Award from the Florida Magazine Association for History Writing. And for more information about her, please go to www.alison.O'Leary.com. Now, please join me in a warm welcome for Alison.
Good evening, folks. Thanks so much for all of you turning out tonight. We have quite a crowd. I don't know if you can see all of the squares as I can, but it's very exciting. I still get really pumped up for presentations since COVID was, just sort of shut everything down very abruptly. And I never knew if we would ever get it rolling again. So I spoke at the library in Milton, what's it been, about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, the first time, and I'm very happy to be back. Again, thank you. Tonight I'll be talking about this book, and I'm sorry with my screen kind of blurred. It's hard to see it, but it's Best Day Hikes Near Boston. It's an Appalachian Mountain Club guidebook. And I'm very happy, as Jean mentioned, to announce that just a month ago, we launched, this book is called Abandoned Ship, and it's a very exciting World War II story. And we're still getting the reviews in. We were mentioned very favorably in a nice weekend story in the Wall Street Journal, which was such a big deal. So as much as I love the research that goes into those history books and all of the work, I truly do enjoy the work in bringing those voices to the present. It's been 80 years since those incidents of World War II in 1942. And as much as I love that work, believe me, getting outdoors is what I need every day to sort of cleanse the stress and release the anxiety and all of that stuff from my day-to-day work as a writer. So with Hikes Through History, what I wanted to do is to just share some of that interest and excitement of getting outdoors in our local neighborhoods, not far from home here in Eastern Massachusetts. Although the book is titled Best Day Hikes Near Boston, it's a little bit of a misnomer because it's actually 60 hikes between Cape Ann on the North Shore and Wellfleet on Cape Cod. So it covers a very broad swath of Eastern Massachusetts. And I wanted to tell you this little tidbit is how I got interested in history to begin with. I grew up in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, a town probably familiar to a lot of you, and in a big family in a house that was too small for all of us. There were 9 of us in a little 3-bedroom house, and we were always outside playing around. One day, one of my brothers had a golf club, and he, swung back and hacked a giant divot out of the backyard. And my first thought was, oh my goodness, Dad is going to kill you. And my second thought was, what is that? because right under where the grass got torn up was a gold coin. Could you believe this kid? His whole life has been like that. He found a gold coin in the exact spot where he swung that golf club. It was marked California Gold Piece 1876. And I remember going with my mother to research it and to find out where this coin came from, how authentic it was, or any of those sorts of details that we could find out about it. So it really put the gears in motion in my mind of, my goodness, who was here in our backyard 100 years before us? And with that, it got my interest sparked in local history. So I will start sharing my screen and tell you about the parks and other places that we can visit and a little bit of the history behind them. Okay, here we go. So that's the cover of the book, 4-season guide to 60 of the best day hikes. And as I said, it says near Boston, but it's all of Eastern Massachusetts and even Cape Cod. It goes out past 495 into the Wachusett Mountain area, some beautiful properties and places to see out there as well. So this talk is really just a smattering. It's about a dozen of what's available in the book. And here's a picture of the front of one of our other books, Inns and Adventures, and it's similar things to do up north in New Hampshire, Vermont, and the Berkshires. Just some fun adventures, hopefully to inspire people to get out and get to know the New England countryside a little bit better. So when we traveled together, things looked like this. It was a little bit crazy. The two of us couldn't go anywhere without taking everything plus the kitchen sink. And I think people on the highway would give us a wide berth because they were afraid of, something coming flying off this crazy clown car of ours. But the good thing about this best day hikes and the hikes through history is that it's all local. So it's not high stress. You don't have to worry about packing. You don't have to worry about having the right equipment or gear because it's very easy in your own backyard, that sort of travel. And the book itself has this wonderful guide trip planner in the front of it. As you know, the Appalachian Mountain Club, what do they do best? They do guidebooks. As you can see in the left-hand side of the picture here, there's the name of the location of where you're thinking about going hiking, and then whether it's easy or hard, how long it is, what the elevation is, the approximate time it would take to do the entire hike, which of course is optional, what there is to see. And then on the far right side, these little icons that tell you if it's good for cross-country skiing. Can you bring your dog? Is it good for snowshoeing? So that's just my little pitch for the book itself. It's really a wonderful resource if you have a couple of hours on a Saturday morning and you don't know what you want to do. You can thumb through it and say, hey, check this out. Have we done this trail? Have we been in this area? Or here's one I've never heard of before. So it also has a map locator in the book so that it shows exactly the location, whether it's inside 128, west of 128, or that sort of thing. Okay, here we are. So let's talk about the cycle of land use in New England, just as sort of a background. The Native Americans burned the land to create new growth that attracted game animals so that they had better hunting. When the European settlers showed up in the early 1600s, they began to cull the timber so that they could build ships and buildings. They started industries. All of those rocks that were in the way got rolled to the edges of properties to become stone walls. And I'm fascinated with stone walls. Having grown up here and played in the woods a lot, I've always wondered about all of those stone walls that always stretch up over hills and in the most impossible places. And I've learned a lot about them through a book called Stone by Stone, which was written by a Connecticut professor named Robert Thorson. And he describes the stone walls as potentially being as many as 240,000 miles long in New England. That's throughout all of the New England states. But think about that, 240,000 miles of stone walls that represent 3 billion hours of work. Those poor farmers had very little to work with, and yet they had to move a lot of those stones so that they could cultivate the land for crops, or roll them out of the way and help create a barrier that would keep their farm animals contained. I understand that if you see a wall that's all big stones, it may mean that the area nearby was a pasture, so they didn't worry about all the little stones. They just wanted to get the big ones out of the way to keep the animals contained. But if you come upon a stone wall that has big stones and little stones, that's more likely to be a site of a cultivated farm field, because they needed to get the little stones out of there too, so that they could run their plows or whatever they had. So thanks to Professor Thornton, he coined this term, beef, bacon, and butter farms, which were really the subsistence lifestyle that the folks in New England had prior to 1800 and the Industrial Revolution. Many of our stone walls that we see out in the woods were built in the late 1700s to the very early 1800s. And in fact, there was a bit of a sheep craze at that time. When the merino sheep were first imported from Spain, a lot of the farmers adopted sheep as their cash crop. And so they had to clear a lot of land so that these sheep could graze and they could reap the wool from the sheep. And that's when a lot of the stone walls were created. So over time, people moved off the farms and the forests regenerated. Now these pictures, and you'll see in the next few slides, are borrowed from the Harvard Forest in Petersham, Mass, where they study the ecology of New England forest. And this is a typical scene. When we look into the woods today, you may see a brook running through an area where there are stone walls and those skinny trees, because the trees have been culled time after time, every couple of generations. As soon as they get to be of any size, they get cut down and used for lumber, or they get cleared for another farm with high hopes of success. But in the beginning, this represents probably in the early, around 1700, when Massachusetts had a very mixed old growth forest with a variety of trees, and things that fell to the ground stayed on the ground to nurture the soil. Over time, in about the 1740s, the European settlers came and they began to clear the land to make little homesteads. As I said, beef, bacon, and butter farms. They were just working hard as can be, 7 days a week, to survive. But over time, many, many more people came to settle the land. The farms were expanded slightly, but as you can see, by the 1830s and 40s, 80% of New England was completely deforested for farming and for the raising of those sheep that I mentioned. But soon enough, the Industrial Revolution would come about and people would start to leave these farms and move to the cities. This is the population in 1810. You can see that Boston had all of, what was it, 33,000 people. Not so big, but the population of Massachusetts was sprinkled very evenly across the entire state. Not too many big cities or towns. And I challenge you to take a look at this map and not think about chicken pox, please. We've had enough plagues. With all of those people spread all across the state, that's why you can go on a hike in the woods and find something like a millstone in a place where you never imagined there had been any settlements whatsoever. So over time, say by the 1880s or 1910, people started to leave those hard-working farms and go to work in the cities for the Industrial Revolution, whether it was textile plants or making machinery that would be used on other farms. You can see the farmland here in the lower right-hand corner is starting to grow back in. The white pines are the very first species to take over old farm fields. As you can see here, there are a couple of men in the lower right-hand corner with a big old cross-cut saw, working very hard to turn those pines into lumber. And the lumber had many uses, of course, to build more homes, railroad ties, ships. Once the Industrial Revolution got going, it was a juggernaut. So after those white pines are cleared and used, then the hardwoods start to come in. And this was the very first Amazon delivery truck ever known to man. Believe it or not, this is an actual picture from a Massachusetts Historical Society. And this was an interesting use of that wood. They could slice white pine in very thin pieces, bundle it together with some twine, and make it into a box for shipping things across the country. So over time, this is probably the 1930s, 1940s. You can see the man in the lower left-hand corner of the picture. He's actually painting the scenery. So this is the great-great-grandson of the earliest settlers back on the family property. He has no idea of all of the work that went into what the farm that was once there, the beef, bacon, and butter farm, because by the 1940s, people were only working probably 5.5 or 6 days a week. You know, that's a lot of leisure time. So he picked up the hobby of painting and is just enjoying the landscape. And that is akin to what we do now. You know, we can just enjoy the landscape and not give a thought to the history behind it. So by 1910, I believe this is, there we go, 1900, you can see that people moved out of those little farmsteads in the tough, hard scrabble parts of the state, moved into the big cities to find their fortunes in industry of one type or another. Boston's population between 1810 and 1900 ballooned from 33,000 to 560,000. Can you believe that in just maybe 2 generations? Above Boston, you can see the Haverhill, Lowell area. West of Boston, Worcester is a gigantic bubble there. South of Boston, you've got New Bedford, Fall River, and those industrial centers. And it just changed the character of Massachusetts forever when the Industrial Revolution took place. But it also prompted the creation of a lot of parks right around this time, around 1900, because our forefathers realized that they had better set aside some land where people could breathe fresh air and recreate at times when they didn't have to be in the tenements, the crowded city living. Come on. Every now and then it doesn't want to change the picture. So again, if you look back and we look into the woods again and we see these stone walls and these skinny trees and the brook, you think about it differently once you know what was there before you. This is an interesting, very grainy, early picture of the stone walls in New England and how they just snaked across the landscape without any trees to interrupt them. And here's a side-by-side comparison of the deforested landscape and then the reforested landscape. And you can see all that thick greenery of the white pines where the fields were more recently grown back in. And I don't want to neglect mentioning that the Native Americans were here long before the European settlers, but did not leave a built-in environment like the European settlers did. You know, very few roads, or they were obliterated, one or the other. Very few roads and buildings and lasting permanent types of structures. So we're starting up north of Boston in the Ipswich, Topsfield area, the Willowdale and Bradley Palmer state parks. They're adjoining state parks, or really a large expanse of conserved property. And the background on Bradley Palmer State Park is pretty interesting. Mr. Palmer was a very well-known, well-to-do attorney in the Boston area at the turn of the previous century in 1900. He was a founding partner of the Palmer and Dodge law firm, but he was an equestrian. He really loved his horses. He was a founder of the Myopia Hunt Club on the North Shore. And he decided in his older years that he wanted to create an estate for himself. So he looked north of Boston and he was able to purchase over 700 acres from a single family up there and establish his estate. It now includes his preserved home, along with many miles of trails for walking, biking. There are wading ponds. There's a lot of animal habitat. And the cool part is just feeling like, oh, this estate belongs to all of us. We get to enjoy it. It's not one of those walled communities, gated communities, where you have to look in from the outside. We can go enjoy this property that Bradley Palmer left us because he had no heirs. This is an overview of some of the trails that you will see there. It's kind of gentle rolling hills, so it's not a lot of steep hills. It's not very challenging terrain. There is quite a bit of wetland because the Ipswich River runs right through it, right under the driveway, as a matter of fact. This is an early picture of the estate. It's a beautiful arts and crafts or craftsman type home made of local stone. Beautiful workmanship throughout. I was told that this dining area was once a stalls for his horses. So this is a man who really enjoyed his horses, kept them very close to him. We do now get to go on tours of the house. There are ranger tours, both the inside that explain the craftsmanship that went into it, the history of the home, and the outside where they talk about the property. They lead walks on the property and also talk about the specimen trees that Mr. Palmer brought home from his many travels around the world. So the 720-acre estate was donated to the state of Massachusetts, and it's the Bay Circuit Trail is also goes through this estate, this state park. So there's lots to see up there. You know, the Bay Circuit Trail is that 231-mile linkage of trails that sort of go in a big ring around the outside of Boston in the suburbs. I've done little bits and pieces of it. I can say, in working on the most recent edition of this book, that people have created some wonderful websites that allow you to follow the Bay Circuit Trail much more easily than you used to be able to. It was years ago, it was sort of something you heard of, but you couldn't figure out how to get there. But now they have these great websites where you can go section by section. So if anyone is looking for a challenge this summer and you want to do the whole 230 miles of the Bay Circuit Trail, there are websites that will guide you on your way. So this goshawk is a species that you might see up there on the Bradley Palmer Estate State Park. This is a predatory bird that might swoop down and take your hat off. So I'm warning you now, they like to perch on the edge of fields and watch for activity, but they're very protective of their nests. So here's the sign for the Bay Circuit Trail, at least it's an old one. that traces part of the route in the area near the Bradley Palmer State Park. And as I said, you know, gentle rolling terrain in the park itself, great for cross-country skiing, snowshoeing. There are a lot of mountain biking trails up there, and it's a pretty busy park year-round. I've been there a lot. When my daughter went to Salem State, I used to go up there and ride my bike every chance I had. So moving on just a little bit into the Medford and Malden neighborhood, we'll visit Middlesex Fells. As I said, a lot of parks in the Boston area were created around the 1890s. This is one that was probably created to protect the reservoir there, Spot Pond, and there are other reservoirs on the western side of the property. Of course, back when it was created in the 1890s, they didn't have the issue of Interstate 93 running through the middle of the park. It was probably a nice, calm sort of road where you would drive your horse on a weekend, drive your horse and buggy on a weekend. But it has, of course, grown to, you know, a major 6-lane highway that you are risking your life on some of the time. But once you get off the highway and get in the area of the park, there are these beautiful parkways, you know, lovely roads that go around the edges of the park so that it's easy to access parking, and it's not quite as exciting as driving on Highway 93. Middlesex Fells has many hiking options. Several of them mentioned in our guidebook are on the left side of this picture, which is the western side of the park near the reservoirs. But I will be talking about the northeastern side where that yellow star is, so keep that in mind. But around the reservoirs, there are beautiful flat places to walk. The trails are pretty easy to navigate. I like to say that if you have time to kill and you're in that area, in the Medford, Malden area, it's a great place to pull over, go for a stroll. You can make it as short or as long as you want by adding or subtracting trails between the reservoirs. If you're up for more of a challenge, there are also, this is the Reservoir Trail, there are also the Skyline Trail, which is very challenging, but gives you beautiful views of Boston, and one called the Rock Circuit, which I don't often recommend unless you're training for some more rugged hiking up in the White Mountains. That's an apt comparison. This is a bit of an ankle twisting route. And the lengths vary quite a bit as well. So now back to the area where the star was on the map. This is the Spot Pond area near the Stone Zoo, the Stoneham side. There was this property called Haywardville. Back in the 1840s, it was a major mill area that employed hundreds of people. They had both a rubber plant and a silk dye mill at this location run by a man named Nathaniel Hayward. And Nathaniel Hayward hired a young man to work for him in the rubber plant, whose name is familiar to all of us. It was Charles Goodyear. And around the time that Goodyear worked here in Haywardville, he apparently began to understand the process of vulcanization, or to develop the process of vulcanization, which, to use a pun, expanded the use of rubber into many new industries and new purposes. Instead of just a rigid material, now it became suitable for making into buckets and boots and raincoats and you name it. So Haywardville became defunct in the 1860s. Interestingly, because we were thrifty New Englanders back then, each one of these buildings, instead of being torn down or just boarded up and left in place, each one of the buildings was repurposed and removed from the site to be used in another town. So if you go to Middlesex Fells looking for Haywardville, I'm afraid you won't find anything more than some plaques. But if you visit the the visitor center here on the shore of Spot Pond over by the Stone Zoo. This is called Bothume House. The visitor center, the rangers have guided tours of Haywardville from time to time. They also have some really neat programs like beginner mountain biking and, guided hikes and things like that. I will say I've done a little exploring in Middlesex Fells, and there are quite a lot of hills. It can be some challenging terrain when you get away from that reservoir walk on the west side of the pond. So now we're moving down into Lynn Woods in the city of Lynn. This is actually a municipal park, not a state park, not a state reservation, 2,200 acres with a variety of terrain, including quite a lot of wetlands. And wetlands, you think, oh, that doesn't make great hiking, particularly this time of year when everything is flooding, but it does make for some wonderful animal spotting, for finding birds and hearing animal calls in the woods, particularly at dusk and dawn. I was out just yesterday with my grandchildren. I was telling Jean at an Audubon sanctuary that has a wetland, and we could hear the spring peepers. We could hear hawks in the trees. Just the auditory part of it was like, wow, spring is really here because of what we could hear. So Lynn Woods, as I said, is an interesting property. There's quite a lot of water, including a Walden Pond, but not Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond, which I will talk about. Lynn Woods goes back a long way due to its proximity to the harbor, to the bay. Let's see, in the middle upper part, it's hard to explain, middle upper part, there is a tiny area circled that says wolf pits. And when I started to look into this project of doing the history of these areas, I thought, wolf pits, what on earth is that? And I looked into it a little further, and I found out that the local historical society wanted to know the answer to the same question. They were like, we've always called this the wolf pits, but we're not really sure why we've called it the wolf pits. So they started to research it, and someone looked in a very old newspaper and discovered that, in fact, way back when the earliest settlers were in Lynn, they were paying bounties for the pelts of wolves that were attacking farmers' sheep in the Lynn area, if you can believe that. That was a long time ago. So I guess they were trapping the wolves somehow in these stone-lined pits and killing them. So as I said, there are some wonderful bird species and things that you can hear if you visit Lynn Woods, including a barred owl, the one on the left, or a wood thrush, which is the one on the right, has one of my favorite trilling calls generally more in the summertime than early in the spring. I think the thrushes take their time coming up from the south, but you can hear owls just about any time of year. And also in Lynn Woods, there's a 48-foot tall stone tower built by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, during the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was basically developed just to keep food on the table of millions of Americans who were starving to death after the Great Depression. There were so many people out of work that they were destitute and truly couldn't find food for their families. So the CCC was created, and they moved these camps full of men into different parklands throughout eastern Massachusetts, including the Blue Hills. I'm sure many of you have seen, they've actually marked the area where the CCC camp was in the Blue Hills. They were up here in Lynn Woods. They created a lot of the town forests, including just the infrastructure. Not all of the properties have these wonderful towers, but the infrastructure like roads and culverts and drainage so that people can actually use the properties in all seasons. So this tower is open most year round. You can climb up it and get a view from the top. But the fun part of Lynn Woods, now this is the really fun part, is Dungeon Rock. And I hope that none of you have heard this story before because I might goof it up. No, I'm just kidding. It has the most ridiculous myth and the most ridiculous true story attached to it. So the myth side of it is back when the early settlers were in Lynn, around the time of the wolf pits, and the British were actually in control of the area, people saw a pirate ship coming into the harbor in Lynn, and they said, oh my goodness, we've got to get awaken the garrison, tell them to go find out what's going on with this pirate ship. And the pirates lowered one of their longboats and started to row ashore. And so a couple of the British sentries went down to the waterfront and they accosted the pirates and they said, what are you doing here? What do you want here in Lynn? And there was a scuffle, and the one or two of the pirates fell dead, and one or two of the sentries fell dead, and one of the pirates escaped with a chest full of treasure, and he went up into Lynn Woods and he hid it under this giant tilting rock, like one of those big glacial erratics that's sort of tipped onto its side. And the story goes that the pirate lived under the rock with his big chest of treasure for the rest of his life until there was a seismic event, like an earthquake, that caused the rock to topple on top of him and crush him and his treasure and bury them forever. So that is the crazy myth behind Dungeon Rock. Now, it gets even crazier, because the true part is in the late 1800s, in the Edwardian period, where people had a little leisure time, they started to play games. And one of the games that they would play was like Ouija. And some of them claimed that they were communing with the dead and they could channel voices from the afterworld back to today. And a man showed up in Lynn named Hiram Marble. Hiram Marble claimed that the pirate was calling to him from beyond the grave and telling Hiram Marble to go to Lynn and to tunnel under that rock and find the pirate treasure. Honest to goodness, this is true. This is documented. Hiram Marble shows up in Lynn, tells people, I'm going to find the pirate treasure, and if you're with me, I will share it with you. So he sold shares in the pirate treasure, smart guy. He started chiseling away at the rock. He dug a little at a time, then he would hold a seance, or he would, do one of those sessions with folks to put them in touch with their loved ones who were passed away. And he managed to hold everything together financially and continued to chisel away at the rock. For a long time, his son joined him, and the two of them worked at this rock for years and years. But unfortunately, Hiram Marble passed away, and his son left town before they ever got to the pirate treasure. But you can go to Lynn Woods, visit Dungeon Rock, and go inside where Hiram Marble and his son dug a 130-foot tunnel that goes into and down under the rock. Sounds like a really fun thing to do with kids or grandkids, or if you're just out for a walk on a weekend. It is open most weekends all year round, and then I think in the summertime more frequently, so maybe every day of the week in spring, summer, fall period. But what a crazy story, huh? That's New England lore for you. So now we're moving out to Walden Pond, the other Walden Pond in Concord, Mass, where, as we know, Henry David Thoreau lived for just 2 months, 2 weeks, and 2 days in a tiny house. He was the original tiny house guy, on the shore of Walden Pond, which is really a lovely, a lovely park, but it hasn't always been what it is now. Now it is quite tranquil, and pretty much returned to its natural state. There are lots of hiking trails. You literally cannot get lost with all of the options that you see there around the pond. Plus you're hemmed in by Route 2, Route 126, and then up on the top part of the page, there's an active railroad line there. So you can't get lost at Walden Pond. Most people just like to perambulate around the pond itself. You know, honestly, I will tell you my little secret. If you go all the way to the back or you know, to the top of the page here, cross the railroad tracks, you're in Walden Woods, and you can walk down to the river, and that is my favorite place when it comes to this area. Walden Pond gets a little bit too busy for me. In fact, when I was working on this chapter of the guidebook, I called up the ranger at the visitor center there. And the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, you're writing about Walden Pond, you're putting it in a guidebook, tell everybody about the parking." And I said, "Okay, I'll tell everybody about the parking." She said, "No, really, you've got to tell people about the parking, that it's really hard to find parking, that they need to check online to see if the parking has been closed for the day." And I said, okay, I'm getting the message. I will definitely put parking front and center. And so we did the book, and I went out to visit Walden Pond. I hadn't been to their new visitor center. It's been open a couple of years now, but I hadn't been to the new visitor center, which is really lovely. You can see on this map, you see all of those dark lines right dead center. Those are all the parking lots around the visitor center. So I went there on a rainy weekday morning in the off season, and it was lovely because it was so quiet. I could pull right up to the visitor center. I didn't have to walk 2 miles from a parking lot. I went inside and I saw that very same ranger that I had spoken to on the phone. And I said, "Hi, I'm the writer who did the guidebook, and we included Walden Pond." And she said, "Did you tell everybody about the parking?" And I went, "Oh my goodness, that's the biggest issue around here." You know what? Walden Pond gets 500,000 visitors a year. When I found out about that, I understood 100%. Parking is a huge headache. They don't allow parking within a very long distance of these designated parking lots. You can't park along the highways. So pay attention to what the ranger said. Check about parking. Go very early, go very late, go on a rainy weekday morning in the off season and really get to enjoy it. Today would have been perfect. The new visitor center has a wonderful video made by Don Henley, the rock star who did the Save Walden Woods project several years back now. And it is still a lovely place to visit. But, you know, over time, it has changed quite a bit, because back at the turn of the century, Walden Pond, and when I say turn of the century, I don't mean the 2000s, I'm sorry, I mean 1900. Walden Pond had campgrounds, it had ballrooms, it had sort of a carnival atmosphere. And slowly over time, they started to phase those things out and return it to more of its natural state, sort of as it was when Henry David Thoreau was alive, perhaps. We don't all know for sure. In fact, in reading his autobiography, I read a really great one that was written in the 1960s. And if anyone is interested, I might be able to cough up the name of it or the name of the author. But, you know, it's always been a busy place. Even when he lived there, there were other people living in the woods. He was able to walk into town and walk to nearby friends' houses. So it's not as though it's completely isolated, but it is a very nice oasis in that part of the metropolitan Boston area. And I look at this picture of the beach and I think, I wonder if my father or my grandparents are in this picture. You know, it's probably from the 1940s, and it was just as popular then as it is now. So Thoreau being a big reason why people go to visit Walden Pond, the actual site of his original cabin. There's just a pile of rocks now, but they have reconstructed a tiny cabin just like his near the visitor center. And, you know, there's great reason for people to be inspired and want to visit this place and sort of make a pilgrimage, because Thoreau has really inspired a lot of us in his writing. And I love to talk about his essay on walking, which was published in the Atlantic magazine in 1862 after his death. And I'll read just a little bit of it, but if you want to Google it, Atlantic magazine, Thoreau, walking, you'll get the entire text. And it's just a wonderful example of fantastic writing, and just this, you can feel his inspiration from his experience as a person who loved the outdoors. Here's just a little bit of it. I think I cannot preserve my health and spirits unless I spend 4 hours a day at least, and it's commonly more than that, sauntering through the woods and over the hills and fields, absolutely free of all engagements. Wouldn't that be nice? So now moving on, there's a picture of the visitor center if you're inclined to go. There's a little bit of that quote. And now we're moving on to a different pond on the South Shore, Burridge Pond. I bet it's one that many of you have not heard of. It's on the Hanson-Halifax line. And I wanted to include it because it's very unlike a lot of the places that we go to recreate in New England. So it has an interesting history of Native American uses. There is a large cedar swamp there, and the white cedars had medicinal purposes for the Native Americans. Their berries contain a high concentration of vitamin C, which of course takes care of some issues like scurvy, things like that. But the wood of the white cedars was also very valuable, not only to the Native Americans, but to the early settlers, because it resists rot. So it was fantastic for shingles, for houses, and for fence posts and those sorts of things. So on the site of Burridge Pond, which is a wildlife management area, there is quite a lot of this white cedar. The earliest settlement in the area, permanent settlement by Europeans, you know, that is written down, was by a man named either Henry or Albert Burridge around 1905. He apparently was the owner of some copper mines in South America, but for some reason he thought he would make a new industry here in southeastern Massachusetts. He landed in the area and began digging up peat moss and floating it down a series of canals to the Taunton River to sell it for heating fuel. And over time, his industries grew to include a dye plant and perhaps, no, I'm thinking it was too early, but, you know, other manufacturing. He built a hotel and some tenements and a railroad station, but over time his property burned down and he moved on. Soon after Mr. Burridge left the area, because the land had been dug up for the peat moss, the cranberry entrepreneurs moved in, and I was very surprised to learn that they were growing cranberries and canning the juice and marketing it as a health food product as early as 1900, 1920, which is kind of surprising. But, you know, if you've seen that movie, The Road to Wellville, you understand that the whole health movement at that time, the sanatoriums, was underway. So this was just another arm of that. And then later on in the 60s and 70s, there was a munitions plant nearby that unfortunately decided to test some of their mortars by lobbing them into the pond and maybe blowing up quite a lot of fish and turtles. But I think that got halted pretty quickly. As I said, this is a wildlife management area. It is not a state park. There are no facilities. The best parking is on the upper right-hand corner of the picture there, where you can see the little P. There are a couple of parking areas, but that one's better. It's much, much bigger. It's right near the railroad tracks. I'm trying to remember the name, if that's Maple Street, maybe in Hanson, but it gives you good access to the property, plenty of places to walk. There are still some active cranberry bogs there, but the really fun part about Burridge Pond is that it's wide open. Most of the time that we're hiking in New England, we're under a canopy of trees, but Burridge Pond, due to the cranberry beginnings of it, the peat moss and cranberries, and the ponds themselves, is wide open. So instead of seeing the leaves and the greenery, you see the beautiful sky, and it attracts a ton of bird species. The Audubon has done a couple of surveys there and found over 81 species of birds on that property, which is really neat. There's a picture of the white cedar and their little berries, very common in this area. Now, see what I mean? It's wide open. You can't get lost here for the most part. You just, walk in one direction for half an hour and turn and walk back the other way. There aren't a lot of visual landmarks. There are some, I remember that there's like a cell phone tower that you can see that's not far from the parking area. So you can walk all you want as long as you can see that cell phone tower and get yourself back there. But it really is kind of refreshing and different to be out there under the sunny skies and not have a lot of trees in sight. So it is a place where you might see a belted kingfisher. They fly very quickly right along the surface of the water. They have a very staccato call, and they're looking for juicy little frogs and worms and things like that to eat. You may also see a wood duck in the area. Not only would you see them in the water, but you may see them in the trees, because they do look for rotten, hollowed out trees to make their nests in the absence of those ubiquitous wood duck houses that people like to put to encourage their population. Now, also down in Burridge Pond, believe it or not, you may see this weird bird. Now, I know Jean has spent some time in Florida, as have I, and you don't often see this bird outside of Florida unless you're visiting Nebraska, Wisconsin, or Alaska. It is a sandhill crane. The sandhill cranes stand about 3.5 feet tall, and they are not at all afraid of people. This is like Big Bird coming to your neighborhood. You can walk right up to them. Not that I've been that close, but you see them on the golf courses down in Florida, and they were not a native species to New England until a couple of years ago when Audubon was doing the bird survey, and they found them here at Burridge Pond. And they thought, oh, come on, these two just got blown off course. They won't be here next year, not to worry. But the birds came back year after year after year and established nests. So now we have sandhill cranes in Massachusetts. It's kind of cool. If you see them flying, they're almost like some sort of dinosaur bird. The wingspan is tremendous, and their call is something between the gobble gobble of a turkey and the gronk 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 of a heron. So remember that. Now I've got to speed up a little bit because I'm falling behind time-wise. We're looking in the Cohasset, Weymouth area here at Whitney and Thayer Woods, which is part of a multi-park complex. I know, not too far from where you folks are in Milton. There used to be a lot of military munitions and missile sites here, but these properties, for the most part, have been turned over to state parks, like, oh my goodness, now I can't think of the name of it. Lots to see, glacial erratics, some beautiful groves, entire groves of rhododendrons, especially in Whitney and Thayer Woods. Wampatuck is the name I was looking for. One of our biggest state parks in Massachusetts, used to be a military munitions site. Whitney and Thayer Woods has a different background, but it is definitely right in there with all of these different former military sites. Turkey Hill hosted a Nike missile silo for a long time, but now it's, back to nature for us to enjoy. And I will like to suggest that if you're headed in this direction, check the Trustees of Reservations website before you go, because they're doing a lot of special events here and at their other locations. So you might want to check your schedule and compare it to theirs and see if you want to jump in on some sort of fun event. I know that last summer at Whitney and Thayer Woods, they did a lot of food trucks and maybe some live acoustic music, and just, giving people more of a reason to come and hike and hang out afterwards. Now, the hiking is a lot of fun due to the glacial erratics in the woods. There is also another site of a place where a person lived under a rock in Whitney and Thayer Woods. You may see a little sign when you're there. It's called Ode's Den, O-D-E. It was a man who lived there in the 20s and 30s, literally under a rock for a long time. But the reason we have Whitney and Thayer Woods as parkland currently is due to Henry Whitney, who was a very well-to-do streetcar owner back in the 1880s. He lived in Brookline, Massachusetts. And if you're familiar with the public broadcasting special called The Race Underground, there's been a documentary created about it. It was a great book written by a former Boston Globe reporter named Doug Most. Really enjoyed it. It was about the competition between Boston, New York, and London for the first subway system. And Henry Whitney, being a entrepreneur with streetcar lines, was very interested in getting it on the ground floor of the subway in Boston. And what I really enjoyed about the book, it really stuck with me, was Doug Most's description of the streetcars on the streets of Boston and New York, and how you could stand on any street corner in the 1880s and be passed by just literally dozens and dozens of streetcars, all pulled by horses. Start to think about it and do the math. All of those horses in the cities in the summertime, and you understand why Henry Whitney built this cute little cottage in Cohasset where he can enjoy the fresh breezes from the ocean, and he didn't have to smell the horses from his streetcar business back up in Boston. So he came down here, enjoyed recreating in the area, owned a large property, and when he passed, it was turned over to a trust, who then turned it over to the Trustees of Reservations, which is such a fabulous organization that preserves so many of our wonderful historic properties throughout Massachusetts. And I will leave it up to Jean if she wants me to keep going. I think we're right up against time. But this is a picture of the former Nike missile silo in the same neighborhood, which has now been turned back into nature, into meadows that the birds can enjoy. You'll see meadowlarks and bobolinks, which are such tiny, tiny little bird species that their bones are literally hollow so that they can perch on individual stalks of grass. It's fascinating. If you get an opportunity to go somewhere like Whitney Woods or Whitney and Thayer Woods, Turkey Hill, and just sit and watch the birds in the meadow in the springtime, it's so much enjoyment. It's sublime. Jean?
Allison, this is
Yes.
really wonderful. I'd like you to keep going, and I think our listeners are really enjoying it. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Allison. But this is fascinating. I'd love you to keep going. So I'm good
Okay,
with that.
thank you. I will.
Okay.
And it's not too many, just a couple more to
Okay.
go, I think.
Sounds
Let's
good.
see, where are we now? We're visiting Blue Hills, right in your own backyard. The Blue Hills was again created in the 1880s, 1890s by the same landscape architect who created Middlesex Fells and many other parks in the outer suburbs or ring around Boston, so to speak. His name was Charles Eliot, and he was an understudy for the famous landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who created the Emerald Necklace and New York's Central Park. So we have him to thank for the Blue Hills and the layout of it. It's over 6,000 acres. I encourage everyone, every time I do this talk, to get a personal tracker on your smartphone before you venture out into the Blue Hills. My book does include some great maps, but honest to God, every time I go into the Blue Hills, I am lost because the map of trails looks like a spilled bowl of spaghetti to me. And their trail markers that they have chosen to use are numbers at the trail junctions that just befuddle me. So I track myself on my phone with an app called Gaia GPS, GAIAGPS.com. You can download a free version of it, or you can pay $20 a year and use it unlimited anywhere in the world, literally. And it's a wonderful device. You can even find your car in a big parking lot if you need to using this tracker. But in the Blue Hills, it's indispensable. I have been lost there many times. I still enjoy it. Lots of different hiking options, whether it's just some of the gentle cart paths or going over some of the very steep hills, or this good old skyline trail that goes completely east to west, west to east. I spent several months one winter and spring hiking there with an AMC group. It was called the Winter Conditioning Hikes. And boy, they really put you through the paces of up and down those tough hills, snowshoes on, snowshoes off. It was really fun, though. I got to know a lot of very interesting people that way. So the AMC is a great way to get to know the Blue Hills and to enjoy some of the lesser known parts of it. Charles Eliot had a tower named after him at the top of Great Blue Hill, one of the easier hikes not far from the Trailside Museum. Just a short climb up the hill and you get some beautiful views of the area. When we were working on the first version of this book, we got in touch with the Friends of the Blue Hills and asked them for pictures from the park that we could use in the book. And I was really blown away by the number and the variety of wildlife pictures that people submitted. Because you think, the Blue Hills is really hemmed in by very congested area, major highways, but there's a wonderful variety of otter and deer and you name it. Oh yes, rattlesnakes too. Let me not forget to mention the rattlesnakes. I always say that unless you're going to stick your hand under a bunch of rocks, you're very unlikely to find one. But I've always said that in my talks. And then wouldn't you know, a few years ago, somebody actually filmed one on her cell phone, probably 6 feet long, crossing a trail in the Blue Hills in the summertime. And the media went crazy. So I do acknowledge, yes, we certainly do have rattlesnakes in the Blue Hills. And isn't it a wonderful thing? So when you hike here, you're very unlikely to actually see much wildlife because it is a very well-used place. You are likely to meet people from all over the world. However, if you stop on the Skyline Trail with that beautiful view of Boston to have your lunch, it's like the United Nations of all the different languages and all of the different types of people you'll meet up there. I don't even know if they got the ski hill going this year. It was brown for the longest time, but we do have a ski hill there since the 1930s, thanks again to the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were actually sent to the Blue Hills and to southeastern Massachusetts in general to eradicate the gypsy moths back in the 1930s. I wish they had done a better job because they are still a scourge, but hey, what can you do? When you do visit the Blue Hills, you can find the former CCC camp area. It was one of the larger camps in all of New England. I think there were upwards of 200 men there, and yes, they were all men, camped there for months at a time, working on the trails and the cart paths and the reservoirs and all of those sorts of things so that we have the park that we do today. And as I said, there's such a variety of terrain. You can go many miles on nice, gentle cart paths, but if you take a left turn, you're going up a steep, craggy, rocky hill, just like you might do in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So you got to pick your trails very carefully there in the Blue Hills. And of course, adjacent to the Blue Hills is Quincy Quarry, which you can see in this historic photo, little tiny people there on the ledges. The very first product of the quarry back in 1825 was 9,000 tons of granite for the Bunker Hill Monument, that they used a purpose-built railway that went on part of the route now of 93 to the Neponset River and then floated on barges up around Boston to Charlestown to build the Bunker Hill Monument. But the granite from the Quincy quarries is everywhere. The lintels of the buildings in Boston, the curbstones in a lot of places. It's just tremendous to think how far and wide that has spread, but you can still hike in the area of the quarry and see the slag heaps and the partially cut pieces of stone. And you can also see some incredible graffiti and rock climbers as well. Now, a lot of folks think that this is sketchy and they don't want to go there and it looks bad, but you know what? I find it very enjoyable. I love to see all the people out in the quarries checking things out, doing some rock climbing. Really, it's a neat legacy for us to have in our local area. Notwithstanding the scary movies that were made there. So wrapping it up, we'll visit Massasoit State Park in Taunton, Massachusetts. It is really a nice little sort of a pocket park. It's not tremendously large, but the earliest settlers who came to that area found in the soil there was bog iron. And so they started to dig it up. And again, just like Henry Burridge and Burridge Pond, once you dig up the resource that you're looking for out of the soil, what is that sandy soil good for? More cranberry bogs. So they smelted all of that bog iron in big forges, big stone forges, and contributed to the creation of various iron pieces, whether it was hardware for ships or for hinges for doors, or you name it. A lot of it came from the Taunton area. And I believe you can still see the remnants of that industry in the park due to some very steep and abrupt hills that look like they're slag hills that were dumped from digging from these sorts of iron bogs. So when we first started working on the book, the previous edition, I was interested in writing about the park because it was very interesting, has a lot of water to recreate around, a lot of trails, but I was told, in fact, the park was closed. And I thought, what's going on with that? So I dug into it a little bit. It turns out that there was a bad storm 10 years before. So we're talking about like 2005, 2007, there was a bad storm that destroyed the campground, did a lot of damage in the park, and the state just said, you know what, we don't have the resources to deal with it. We're going to close it down. But thanks to the perseverance of the local folks who love that park, they took care of the trails and they lobbied the state. And by the time the book came out, the park had been restored, reopened. They have a lovely campground reopened there and lots of wonderful trails. Sometimes, you know, you feel like you're all by yourself in this beautiful park, even if there are plenty of other people enjoying the trails. There's a body of water called Lake Rico that people take their kayaks in. This is an area where they will release endangered species like the red-bellied cooter turtles that are native to New England, but are unfortunately threatened by development. And this is a picture of the bog iron. In case you run across a piece of it, put it in your pocket. I'm sure you want to take it home and smelt it on your kitchen stove. This is a picture of an example of an iron forge. This one is up in New Hampshire. The one in Taunton no longer exists, but it was there for many, many years. It was called the King's Foundry. It operated for over 100 years. And very interestingly, in 1637, one of the major landowners in that area of the park was a woman named Elizabeth Poole, who owned over 5,100 acres. And I believe she ran the King's Forge as well. So that wraps up my program. Thank you so much for listening. I'll leave you with this thought. I took a walk in the woods and came out taller than the trees. Thanks again to Thoreau. And thank you, Jean, for having me tonight and for everyone putting up with me.
You are
running
welcome,
over time.
Alison. That was wonderful. I learned so much that I did not know about trails in Massachusetts history. Some very interesting stories. So we do have a couple of questions. Paula says, do you come across many waterfalls along your hikes?
Interesting. Waterfalls in Eastern Mass. I have to think about that. You know, this year will probably be a good one for waterfalls. But when I think of waterfalls, I usually think of like Royalston Falls, which is in north central Massachusetts up by Tully Lake. There's another big waterfall right at Tully Lake. Or Western Massachusetts, Wacona Falls State Park has a long cascade, or Bashbish Falls in the far southwestern corner of the state. So I think you have to kind of pick and choose. In Eastern Mass, I honestly cannot think of a lot of waterfalls that aren't dam spillways.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that, Alison, and Paula for your question. And then Bob's asking any comments, history about the Hale Reservation?
Oh, Hale Reservation. I have actually spent a lot of time in Hale Reservation without knowing much about the history, I'm afraid. I used to live in Medfield, and I love how Noanet Woodlands and Hale are contiguous, and the trails cross from one into the other. Beautiful, beautiful place to walk. I know about the iron. Was it an iron? No, it wasn't an iron forge. It was a mill in Noanet where the brook comes through. But Hale itself, I'm afraid I don't know the history of that property. You've stumped me.
Okay,
Thank you for
Bob.
asking. I will have to go look it up.
Okay, Bob, you gave her another project, I think.
It did.
So with that, okay, and you've had a lot of positive, wonderful accolades here for a very enjoyable evening and a lot of thank yous. Dottie is asking, are there any safety concerns in reference to crime in the parks you describe?
I am glad you asked. I often get that question, particularly from women. And I will tell you, maybe I'm different, but I go everywhere alone. I mountain bike alone. I hike alone a lot. I have never, ever had an issue. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So what I encourage is if you are concerned, even in the least amount of concern, check out a local hiking group. Different conservation commissions in different towns will be able to point you toward hiking groups. There are meetup groups. There are Facebook hiking groups. The Blue Hills has the most hiking groups I have ever seen just on Facebook. So you can find any number of hiking groups or people to hike with who can at least show you around a property you're unfamiliar with. And I have had great experiences with all of those different types of hiking groups. So nothing to be worried about really. And as a side note, I have done a whole lot of writing about crime across the United States and dug deep into the FBI and the Department of Justice crime statistics. And I have to reassure you that in Eastern Massachusetts, we live in a bubble. We are so fortunate to be relatively crime-free, that there's very little to worry about in relation to the rest of the country.
Oh, that's good to know. That's very good to know. Okay, thank you for that. And Kathleen says, laughed at the CC camp. My uncle was stationed at the Blue Hills guarding the weather station from the North Koreans.
That's a good one.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that comment. Interesting, huh? Well, this was really great. And I think we're all inspired to get outside and go hiking. In fact, I just texted my husband to ask him if we can go now. So thank you very much. So
Great.
good to have you here, have you back again, and to get to see you. I'll even virtually, Alison was here talking about one of her nonfiction books previously with us, which was also very enjoyable. So maybe we'll have you back again, and good luck with your writing. And I just want to thank everyone for being here. And I guess
Thank you so much, Jean.
Okay. And I guess at this point, I'll just say, see you next time. All right. Happy hiking, everyone.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good
Thank
night.
you.